Imagine you are sitting on the most powerful music technology company in the world. You have the artists, you have the hardware, you have the content, you have everything you need to own the future of music. And then a computer company walks in, takes everything you built, and turns it into a $1 trillion empire. Well, you watch. That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what happened to Sony. Welcome. Today we are going back to the year 2001, a time when Sony was not just a company, it was a cultural institution. From the Walkman to the PlayStation, from Trinitron televisions to Columbia Records, Sony controlled both the technology people used and the content they consumed. And yet, within just a few years, a computer company that had never sold a single music player rewrote the entire music industry. Today we are going to find out exactly how that happened and why Sony never saw it coming. Part 1. The empire Sony built. To understand how Sony lost, you first have to understand what Sony was. In 1979, Sony introduced the Walkman, a pocket-sized cassette player that changed the way human beings experienced music. Before the Walkman, music was something you listened to at home, or in a car, or at a concert. After the Walkman, music was something you carried with you everywhere. It became personal. It became portable. It became part of daily life in a way it had never been before. That single product defined a generation, and it made Sony one of the most admired technology companies on the planet. But Sony did not stop there. Throughout the 1980s and 1990s, the company kept building. They acquired CBS Records in 1988, turning it into Sony Music Entertainment, one of the largest music labels in the world. They acquired Columbia Pictures, giving them a massive library of films. They built the PlayStation, which became the dominant force in home gaming. They developed the Discman, the mini-disc player, and dozens of other consumer electronics that defined what quality technology looked and felt like. By the late 1990s, Sony was in a position that no other company in the world could match. They owned the hardware, the devices people used to listen to music. They owned the content, the music itself, through Sony Music. And they had the brand trust, the engineering talent, and the global reach to bring anything they wanted to market. People inside the industry called this vertical integration. The idea was simple. If you control the entire chain, from the creation of content to the device that plays it, you control the customer. You control the experience. You control the money. Sony did not just have this position. They had fought hard for it. They had spent billions of dollars building it, and they were deeply, deeply proud of it. That pride, as we will see, is exactly what destroyed them. Part 2. The digital wave arrives in the mid-1990s. Something new began to happen. The internet was growing, computers were becoming faster, and a new file format called the MP3 began spreading across the world. The MP3 was not complicated. It was simply a way of compressing a music file so that it was small enough to store on a computer or send over the internet. A full CD that once took up 700 megabytes could now be compressed to 7 or 8 megabytes. You could store hundreds of songs. You could share them instantly. For consumers, this was extraordinary. For the music industry, it was terrifying. Napster arrived in 1999 and made the threat impossible to ignore. Millions of people were downloading music for free. Record label sales began to fall. And the question everyone in the industry should have been asking was this: who is going to build a legal, paid alternative? Here is what is remarkable. Sony saw this coming. Engineers inside Sony had been working on digital music players since the mid-1990s. They understood the technology. They understood what consumers wanted. They had a music library that was the envy of every other company in the world. And yet they did nothing. Or rather, they did the wrong things. Sony released a product in 1999 called the Vaio Music Clip. It held about 30 minutes of music, and it required you to use a proprietary Sony format called a TRAC, because Sony's hardware engineers were not allowed to support MP3, the format that everyone else was using. Why? Because Sony Music, the record label, was afraid. They believed that a Sony device that played MP3 files would make it easier for people to pirate Sony Music's own catalog. This was the beginning of the real problem. Not a technology failure, not an innovation failure, a people failure. Two divisions of the same company, pulling in opposite directions, paralyzing the entire organization. The hardware engineers wanted to build what consumers were demanding. The music executives wanted to protect what they already had. And caught between them, Sony's leadership could not make a decision, so they made compromises. And in the technology industry, compromises almost never win. Part 3. What Apple did differently. Now let us talk about Apple. Because the story of Apple's entry into music is not simply a story of brilliance. It is a story of clarity. In 2001, Apple was not a dominant company. They had just returned from the brink of bankruptcy a few years earlier. Steve Jobs had come back, launched the iMac, and stabilized things. But Apple's market share was small. They were a computer company. Nobody in the music industry was worried about them. Jobs looked at the digital music landscape and saw exactly what Sony could not bring itself to see. A massive opportunity that nobody was executing well. The MP3 players that existed were clunky, complicated, and held to few songs. A legal alternative to Napster did not exist. The record labels were suing their own customers instead of building a better product. Jobs made a decision that Sony could not make. He decided to simply give consumers what they wanted. In October 2001, Apple launched the iPod. It held 1,000 songs. It had a clean, simple interface. It weighed less than 2 cigarette packs. And critically, it supported MP3, the format consumers were already using. But the iPod alone was not the masterstroke. The masterstroke came in April 2003. When Apple launched the iTunes Music Store, for the first time, consumers could buy individual songs legally for 99 cents each, downloaded directly to their device. No subscription, no complicated software, no proprietary formats, just simplicity. To make this work, Jobs had to convince the major record labels to license their music. And here is where his genius showed. He walked into meetings with executives who were fighting piracy with lawsuits and told them something simple. Your customers are already downloading music illegally. You can either keep fighting that, or you can get paid for it. Sony Music, of course, was one of those labels. And here is the extraordinary irony. Sony Music signed the deal with Apple. The content division of Sony agreed to license its music to a competitor whose platform would ultimately make Sony's hardware division irrelevant. One hand of Sony was feeding the business that would destroy the other hand, and nobody at the top of the company stopped it. Part 4. The internal war. To be fair to Sony, the problem they faced was genuinely difficult, but it was not impossible. Other companies have faced similar internal conflicts and navigated them. Sony could not, and the reason for that goes all the way to the top. Sony in the late 1990s and early 2000s was led by executives who came primarily from the entertainment side of the business. They thought like label executives. They thought about protecting existing revenue. They thought about piracy, control, and rights management. Steve Jobs thought like a product designer. He asked one question above all others: what does the customer want to do? And then he figured out how to let them do it as simply as possible. Inside Sony, engineers and entertainment executives spoke different languages. The engineers would propose a new digital product. The entertainment executives would list all the ways it could be misused. The engineers would add restrictions. The product would become slow and complicated, and then it would go to market and fail, because consumers had already moved on. This cycle repeated itself over and over. Sony released product after product in the early 2000s. The network Walkman, the Connect Music Store, various ATR/AC-based devices, and each one failed. Not because Sony lacked engineering talent, not because they lacked money, but because each product was designed around Sony's fears rather than the customer's needs. There is a term for this in business, the innovator's dilemma. It describes how successful companies often fail to adapt to disruption because they are too focused on protecting what they already have. Sony is one of the clearest examples of this principle ever recorded. They were so afraid of what digital music might do to their content business that they refused to build the digital music product their hardware business could have owned. They chose protection over progress, and they paid for it dearly. By 2004, the iPod had become a cultural phenomenon. Apple's revenue from music was growing at a rate that shocked the industry. Sony's music player business was shrinking, and the gap between what Apple was offering and what Sony was offering was too wide to explain away. Part 5. The lessons that outlast the story. Sony eventually tried to catch up. In 2004, they hired Howard Stringer, the first non-Japanese CEO in the company's history, with a mandate to unify the company and compete with Apple. It was too late, not because Sony lacked talent or technology. It was too late because the habits of the organization had hardened. The culture of protection had defeated the culture of creation. By 2007, when Apple launched the iPhone and redefined what a portable device could do, Sony was not even part of the conversation. So what are the lessons here? There are 3 that matter most, and they apply far beyond the music industry. The first lesson is this: Your greatest asset can become your greatest liability. Sony's ownership of both content and hardware was supposed to be their superpower. Instead, it created a conflict that paralyzed them. Every organization has strengths that, held too tightly, become obstacles. The question to ask is always, are we protecting this because it is still valuable, or because we are afraid of what happens if we let go? The second lesson is about customer focus. Apple did not win because they were smarter than Sony in every way. They won because they asked a simpler question and answered it more honestly. What does a person who loves music actually want? They want 1,000 songs in their pocket. They want to pay a fair price. They want it to be easy. Apple built that. Sony built what Sony was comfortable building. The customer chose. The third lesson is the hardest one to apply. Organizational structure is strategy. Sony failed in part because no single person had the authority and the will to override both the hardware division and the entertainment division and force them toward a common goal. The structure of the company made the right decision nearly impossible. Apple, by contrast, was organized around the product and the customer. Jobs had final authority, and he used it to cut through every internal objection. When a company is structured around protecting what it has, it will protect those things, even at the cost of its own future. That is not a failure of intelligence. It is a failure of design. Sony is still a large and profitable company today. The PlayStation remains one of the most successful gaming platforms in the world. But the music player business, the one that should have been theirs by birthright, was handed to Apple on a silver platter. Not because Apple was lucky, because Sony could not get out of its own way. There is something almost tragic about the Sony story. If you look at it closely enough, they were not villains. They were not incompetent. They were talented people working at a great company, trying to protect something they had spent decades building. And in doing so, they lost far more than they ever could have saved. The $1 trillion that Apple built on the back of the iPod, the iTunes Store, the iPhone, and everything that followed, much of that value traces back to a single turning point. The moment when Apple decided to give consumers what they wanted, and Sony decided not to. That moment was not inevitable. It was a choice. And choices like that are made every day, in boardrooms and product meetings and strategy sessions all over the world. The question is never whether disruption is coming. The question is always whether you will be the one who shapes it, or the one it leaves behind. Thank you for watching. If this story made you think, consider sharing it with someone who would appreciate it. There is more to come. We will see you in the next one.